The year everything almost fell apart was 1780, when multiple crises converged, threatening to destroy American Revolution before independence could be achieved. Opens with America's darkest moment. As military situation deteriorated rapidly, financial system collapsed, and popular support wavered when years of sacrifice seemed to produce only continued suffering without visible progress toward victory. The South collapsing after British captured Charleston in May with over 5,000 Continental troops surrendering, catastrophic loss eliminating organized American resistance throughout South Carolina and Georgia. Congress bankrupt without ability to pay soldiers or purchase supplies. Worthless Continental currency making procurement impossible when merchants refused payment in paper money. The army starving because supply system had broken down completely. Soldiers receiving irregular rations insufficient for maintaining health or combat readiness. Mutinies rising in Pennsylvania and New Jersey units, whose unpaid soldiers threatened to march on Congress demanding back wages. Military discipline dissolving when material conditions became unbearable. Morale shattered after 5 years of war had produced battlefield victories that did not translate into British withdrawal. Exhaustion replacing earlier revolutionary enthusiasm among populations bearing war's costs. And Washington losing ground literally through being forced to retreat repeatedly while lacking resources for offensive operations that might have reversed war's momentum. Whispers of defeat spread everywhere, as even committed patriots questioned whether independence was achievable when British controlled major cities and when American military forces seemed incapable of forcing decisive conclusion. Into this chaos comes Traitor, whose identity has been lost to history despite his actions' significance, his betrayal being forgotten because it produced outcomes opposite to his intentions. One history forgot deliberately through suppressing his name to avoid glorifying treason even accidentally, his erasure being so complete that modern historians debate his identity. Whose betrayal unintentionally saves revolution through triggering British mistakes that gave Washington crucial advantages at moment when American cause seemed doomed, making forgotten Traitor's failed treachery accidentally decisive for American survival, when his attempt to destroy revolution instead preserved it through producing British operational failures that gave Continental Army breathing room when collapse seemed imminent during 1780's cascading crises. The unknown officer with dangerous secret was mid-level Continental Army officer whose position gave him access to sensitive information about troop dispositions and operational planning without making him sufficiently prominent that historians would later document his activities thoroughly, introduce the man whose name survives only in fragmentary records and whose biography remains sketchy because contemporary documents were destroyed or suppressed after his betrayal was discovered, is less than #0. 9# is greater than. A mid-level officer holding rank of major or lieutenant colonel, senior enough to attend planning meetings, but junior enough that his opinions were not recorded in official correspondence that would have preserved his identity for history. Continental officer serving since war's early years, his experience and competence having earned him positions of responsibility despite lack of political connections that would have accelerated his promotion. Respected by superiors who valued his administrative abilities and his reliability in executing orders, his reputation for competence making his eventual betrayal particularly shocking, by superiors whose confidence in his loyalty would make his treason more damaging when his access to sensitive information was exploited for British benefit. Overlooked by historians who focused on prominent generals and dramatic battles, while ignoring staff officers whose contributions seemed mundane despite being essential for armies functioning, his historical invisibility beginning before his betrayal and being completed by deliberate suppression afterward, by historians whose narratives emphasized heroism and sacrifice rather than documenting betrayals that complicated simple stories about revolutionary commitment. Simmering with resentment about lack of recognition and reward for his service, personal grievances accumulating as more junior officers with better connections received promotions that he believed his competence deserved, and desperation as financial situation deteriorated when Congress's inability to pay wages created personal crisis, threatening his family's survival. Combination of resentment and desperation creating psychological conditions where betrayal seemed justified as response to perceived injustices that service had brought him rather than rewards he had expected. The motive was a combination of financial desperation, ideological disillusionment, and personal despair that transformed loyal officer into traitor willing to betray cause he had served for years. Debt, disillusionment, and despair representing three factors whose convergence made betrayal seem rational, despite moral and practical risks that normally would have deterred treason. Why he turns toward British begins with unpaid wages accumulating over months, as Congress lacked funds for compensating army, his service producing debt rather than income when he borrowed money for supporting family. Unpaid wages creating financial crisis when creditors demanded payment that officer could not provide from non-existent army salary. Debts mounting as expenses continued, while income disappeared. Family starving was not metaphorical exaggeration but literal description of wife and children suffering malnutrition because officers' inability to send money home meant they depended on charity or on selling possessions for survival. Starving because Continental Army's collapse as economic institution eliminated officers' ability to support dependents who had sacrificed alongside soldiers by enduring poverty that military service imposed on families. Congress ignoring him when he petitioned for back pay or for assistance with debts incurred through military service, bureaucratic indifference to individual officers' suffering, demonstrating institutional callousness, and his growing belief that revolution is doomed based on military situation's deterioration and based on Congress's financial collapse, suggesting that American independence was unachievable fantasy rather than realistic goal, worth continued sacrifice. A perfect storm for betrayal when financial desperation, family crisis, institutional indifference, and ideological disillusionment combined to make treason seem like rational survival strategy rather than moral failing. Officer concluding that saving his family by accepting British payment was more defensible than continuing loyalty to cause that had betrayed him through failing to honour implicit contract that service would be rewarded rather than punished through impoverishment, and through watching family starve, while Congress ignored his desperate pleas for assistance that would have prevented betrayal's psychological and material preconditions from developing into actual treason. The decision to switch sides was deliberate choice made after weeks of internal struggle, where officer weighed loyalty against survival, ultimately concluding that British service offered better prospects than continued continental service that was destroying his family. He makes contact with British agents through intermediaries who had facilitated other defections, initial approaches being cautious to avoid detection while establishing communication channels. With British agents whose presence in occupied cities and whose networks in countryside allowed contact with disaffected continental officers, British intelligence operations actively recruiting American officers through offering payment and protection. Contact being established through coded messages or through meetings arranged by intermediaries whose identities protected both parties from exposure if negotiations failed to produce agreement. Offering intelligence on troop positions whose locations were known to officer through his staff responsibilities, requiring knowledge of Continental Army's dispositions for administrative planning, his access to sensitive information making him valuable potential source. On supply depots whose locations and contents were documented in records that officer could access or memorize, logistics information being particularly valuable for British operational planning. And continental weaknesses, including morale problems, supply shortages, and organizational dysfunctions that officer observed directly through his position, qualitative assessments of American military condition being as valuable as quantitative data about positions and strengths. Continental weaknesses whose exploitation could allow British to achieve decisive victories that officer believed were inevitable regardless of his betrayal, making treason seem like accepting reality rather than causing American defeat. Offering suggesting that officer initiated providing information rather than merely responding to British requests, his proactive intelligence sharing indicating commitment to betrayal rather than reluctant cooperation, making his treason more damaging because his initiative meant he provided information that British might not have known to request, giving them intelligence windfall whose value exceeded typical defector contributions through combining access to sensitive information with willingness to provide comprehensive assessments based on insider knowledge that British could not obtain through other sources available to their intelligence networks operating in American-controlled territories. The British plan, based on his information, was operational design, exploiting intelligence about Continental Army's dispositions and weaknesses that Traitor had provided through his correspondence with British agents. Using his intel about troop positions and supply vulnerabilities, British commanders design operation intended to destroy significant Continental force through converging attacks that would prevent American retreat or reinforcement. British commanders whose confidence in intelligence accuracy led them to design ambitious operation, whose complexity required precise timing and coordination, Traitor's detailed information, convincing them that risk was justified by potential decisive victory. Design operation meant to crush major Continental force through surprise attack, exploiting weaknesses that intelligence had revealed. British planning assuming that information was current and complete. In one decisive blow that would eliminate significant American combat power while demonstrating that Continental Army could not defend territory against determined British offensive operations, psychological impact being as important as military damage. Decisive, suggesting that British intended operation to be war-ending strike rather than tactical victory, their ambitions reflecting confidence that intelligence had given them decisive advantages. Meant to crush, suggesting total destruction rather than tactical defeat, British operational objectives being elimination of Continental force as fighting organization through achieving casualties and captures that would prevent unit from reforming. Major Continental force whose destruction would significantly impact American military capabilities and would demonstrate British capacity for offensive operations that Americans could not counter effectively. In one blow, requiring operational coordination and timing that British normally executed well, but that Traitor's intelligence made seem easier than reality would prove, when assumptions about intelligence's completeness and currency were tested through actual operations. British confidence in intelligence, leading them to underestimate difficulties that rapid exploitation would create through forcing commanders to act before adequate preparations were completed. Making plan dependent on assumptions that intelligence was perfect and that Continental Army would remain where Traitor had reported, without detecting British preparations, whose scale made concealment difficult despite operational security. Measures that British implemented. The British strike too early was tactical mistake, resulting from overconfidence in intelligence that Traitor had provided. British commanders' eagerness to exploit information leading them to launch operation before preparations were adequate. The intel is good in sense that information about Continental positions and weaknesses was accurate when Traitor provided it, his access and observations, giving British reliable intelligence about American dispositions. Too good because intelligence quality convinced British commanders that opportunity was extraordinary and that delay might allow circumstances to change, perceived intelligence value creating pressure to act immediately. Eager to exploit information before it became obsolete through Continental troop movements or before security compromise revealed that British knew American positions, commanders rushed operational timeline. British commanders act before they're ready logistically and organizationally, inadequate preparation time meaning that supplies were insufficient and that unit coordination was incomplete when operation began. Before ready suggesting that additional days would have improved chances, but that eagerness to exploit intelligence made commanders willing to accept risks from premature execution. They're ready, meaning logistical preparations were incomplete, and subordinate commanders had inadequate time for understanding their roles in complex operation requiring coordination, rushed timeline creating confusion. Act prematurely through launching attacks before all units were positioned properly, and before reconnaissance had confirmed that Continental forces remained where intelligence indicated, assumptions replacing verification when time pressure prevented adequate preparation. Too early in sense that additional preparation time would have revealed problems with operational plan and would have allowed correcting coordination issues, but British commanders' confidence in intelligence, made them believe that speed was more important than thoroughness when exploiting opportunity that traitors' information had created, making premature execution direct result of intelligence's perceived quality that convinced commanders they possessed decisive advantages, justifying accepting risks from inadequate preparation rather than delaying for completing. Preparations that might have made operations successful instead of disastrous failure that rushing produced. Washington moves instantly was American response when British operational preparations scale and timing suggested major offensive was imminent, even though specific objectives remained unclear. The premature British action, whose hurried execution created detectable indicators that American intelligence observed through scouting reports and through civilian informants, noticing unusual British activities, alerts Washington that something massive is coming, based on pattern recognition from previous British operations, unusual troop movements and supply concentrations indicating preparations for significant offensive. That something beyond normal operations was being prepared became apparent through scale of British activities that exceeded routine garrison rotations or patrol operations, indicators suggesting major offensive, despite British attempts at operational security. He shifts troops from positions where British attack seemed less likely toward areas where intelligence suggested British were concentrating forces, Washington's response being based on incomplete information, but accurate assessment that major threat was developing. Fortifies positions through improving defensive works and through positioning reserves for reinforcing threatened sectors, preparations being prudent responses to indicators that major British offensive was imminent. And avoids trap that British operation had intended by moving forces away from positions where traitors' intelligence had indicated they would be. Washington's movements based on threat assessment rather than on knowledge of specific British plan. Trap, meaning British operational design, had assumed continental forces would remain in positions where intelligence indicated they were vulnerable. Washington's movements invalidating key assumptions underlying British plan. Instantly suggesting rapid response without bureaucratic delays, Washington's authority and experience allowing him to reposition forces quickly based on threat indicators that less experienced commander might have dismissed as routine British activities, his instant response being decisive factor in avoiding disaster that British plan would have produced if continental forces had remained in positions where traitors' intelligence indicated they were vulnerable to converging attacks, whose timing and objectives remained unclear, but whose scale suggested existential threat requiring immediate defensive responses that Washington implemented based on fragmentary intelligence, suggesting major British offensive, whose details were unknown, but whose reality was confirmed through indicators that British commanders' rushed execution had made detectable. The British operation implodes was result of premature execution, whose coordination failures produced tactical disaster rather than decisive victory that plan had promised. The attack fails because rushed timeline meant units were not positioned properly, and because subordinate commanders had inadequate understanding of their roles in complex operation requiring precise coordination. Because it was rushed through commanders' eagerness to exploit intelligence before opportunity disappeared. Inadequate preparation time, producing coordination failures and logistical shortages. Timing off meant attacks that should have been simultaneous occurred sequentially, allowing continental forces to shift defenses rather than being overwhelmed by coordinated assault from multiple directions. Units scattered because rapid mobilization prevented proper assembly, forces being distributed across terrain in ways that made mutual support impossible when attacks occurred. Coordination broken when communication failures and timing errors meant that units attacked independently rather than as coordinated force, isolation making them vulnerable to defeat in detail by continental defenders. A disaster caused by trusting Traitor too much, in sense that intelligence quality convinced British commanders that operation would succeed despite inadequate preparation, overconfidence in intelligence, leading to underestimation of execution difficulties. By trusting intelligence's accuracy without verifying that conditions remained as reported or that continental forces had not moved since intelligence was gathered, assumptions based on intelligence replacing reconnaissance that would have revealed that circumstances had changed. too much meaning that intelligence became substitute for proper preparation rather than being input informing adequate planning. British commanders' faith in traitors' information, leading them to accept risks that prudent military judgment would have rejected as excessive when operations' complexity required more preparation time than eagerness to exploit intelligence allowed, making operational failure direct result of treating intelligence as guarantee of success rather than as advantage that still required proper execution through adequate preparation and coordination that rushed timeline prevented, transforming what might have been successful operation into disaster that demonstrated intelligence alone could not compensate for inadequate preparation when operational complexity required time that commanders were unwilling to invest before opportunities disappeared. The Continental Army survives, unthinkable was outcome, when Washington's defensive preparations and British operational failures combined to prevent disaster that should have destroyed significant American force. Washington narrowly avoids annihilation through combination of luck, skill, and British mistakes that made failed British operations serve American interests better than successful defensive battle might have achieved. Narrowly suggesting that margin between survival and destruction was small, American success being contingent rather than inevitable when examining how close British came to achieving objectives despite operational failures. Avoids annihilation that British plan would have produced if executed properly. Continental Army's survival, depending on British mistakes rather than on American defensive superiority when examining force ratios and tactical situations. Thanks to flawed execution whose coordination failures allowed Washington to defeat British units sequentially rather than facing coordinated assault that would have overwhelmed continental defenses. Flawed meaning British operational execution failed to achieve coordination that plan required, mistakes being tactical rather than strategic when examining how sound concept was undermined by poor implementation. Without realizing it initially, Washington did not understand that British operations' premature execution resulted from traitors' intelligence, defensive success being attributed to continental vigilance rather than to British overconfidence. The traitor has just saved war through providing intelligence that convinced British to attack before ready. Unintended consequence being that betrayal produced British defeat rather than American disaster. Just saved meaning timing was crucial for American survival when military situation was desperate, failed British operations timing during crisis, making its failure decisive for preventing American collapse. War being saved rather than merely battle, because 1780's cascading crises meant that major continental defeat might have been final blow, ending revolution, making British operational failure that traitors' intelligence had inadvertently produced into war-saving event whose significance exceeded immediate tactical results through occurring at moment when American cause could not absorb another major defeat without collapsing completely, making traitors' imperfect betrayal accidentally decisive for revolution's survival. The traitor is discovered was inevitable outcome when American counterintelligence uncovered correspondence, revealing his communications with British agents. American counterintelligence uncovers his correspondence through intercepting messages or through informant revealing traitor's identity, discovery being result of security measures that officers' caution had temporarily evaded, but that eventually detected his activities. His correspondence with British handlers whose captured or decoded messages revealed traitor's identity and detailed information he had provided. Documentary evidence making denial impossible, uncovers through systematic investigation of suspected security breaches, counterintelligence operations, identifying officer as source of intelligence that British operation had demonstrated they possessed about continental positions and plans. He's arrested immediately after evidence confirmed his guilt, military police taking him into custody before he could flee to British lines or destroy additional evidence of his betrayal. Arrested, suggesting swift action without warning that might have allowed escape, speed being essential for preventing traitor from alerting British that security compromise had occurred. Condemned through court-martial that found him guilty of treason based on correspondence evidence and perhaps on confession extracted during interrogation, verdict being inevitable when evidence was conclusive. and erased from public memory through deliberate suppression of his name and through destruction of records documenting his service, erasure being policy decision to prevent Traitor from achieving historical recognition even as villain. From public memory completely through refusing to publish his name in accounts of court-martial and through removing references to him from official records that survived, institutional decision to deny him historical existence, reflecting desire to prevent his case from becoming precedent or inspiration for future traitors, making his erasure so thorough that historians debate his identity centuries later when fragmentary evidence suggests betrayal occurred, but perpetrator's name was successfully suppressed through systematic elimination of documentation that would have preserved his identity, leaving only indirect evidence that unnamed traitor existed, whose actions paradoxically saved revolution he had attempted to destroy through providing intelligence that British trusted too much and exploited too quickly. Washington's fury and secret relief represented contradictory emotions when Commander understood that Traitor's betrayal had inadvertently benefited American cause despite its malicious intent. Washington calls him villain publicly, through condemning treason in orders and correspondence that emphasized betrayal's heinousness, public denunciation being necessary for maintaining discipline and for deterring future traitors through demonstrating that betrayal would be punished severely and condemned absolutely. Him as example of perfidy that Continental Army would not tolerate, Washington's public statements making clear that treason was unforgivable, crime deserving execution and historical condemnation. Villain, whose betrayal represented personal affront to Washington and whose actions had endangered army that Washington commanded, betrayal being particularly painful because Traitor had been trusted officer, whose responsibilities gave him access to sensitive information. But privately knows that British attack's premature execution had provided warning that allowed Continental Army to avoid disaster, Washington's private understanding being that Traitor's intelligence had backfired against British through convincing them to act before ready. That British attack tipped him off through its scale and timing, revealing that major offensive was imminent, indicators allowing Washington to reposition forces defensively. At perfect moment when Continental Army was vulnerable, but before British were fully prepared, timing being optimal for American defensive response that might not have succeeded if British had waited for completing preparations. Perfect, suggesting that earlier warning might have been dismissed as false alarm, while later warning would have been too late for effective response. Actual timing, allowing maximum defensive preparation before British struck. Tipped him off, meaning Washington gained intelligence advantage through observing British preparations, whose rushed timeline created detectable indicators, ironic outcome being that Traitor's betrayal had improved American intelligence rather than giving British decisive advantage, making Washington's private relief understandable despite public fury, when recognizing that botched British operation resulting from Traitor's intelligence had saved Continental Army from disaster at moment when American cause could not afford major defeat, creating situation where Traitor simultaneously deserved execution for betrayal and credit for unintentionally saving revolution through providing British with intelligence they trusted too much. The British lose faith in their spies was long-term consequence when operational failure triggered recriminations about intelligence, quality, and about agents' reliability. The failed operation triggers distrust inside British intelligence through demonstrating that acting on agent intelligence could produce disasters when information was outdated or when overconfidence led to inadequate preparation, failure making commanders question whether trusting agents was worth operational risks. Triggers, meaning operational failure, was catalyst for broader reassessment of intelligence operations. British commanders concluding that intelligence could be misleading or could encourage premature action. Distrust inside British intelligence community, whose members blamed each other for operational failure, recriminations damaging internal cohesion, and making intelligence officers more cautious about assessments. They second-guess future informants whose reliability became suspect after high-confidence intelligence had produced operational disaster, skepticism about agents' information making British less willing to act on intelligence reports. Future informants being treated with suspicion rather than trust, intelligence from defectors, or from recruited agents being subjected to excessive verification that delayed exploitation, and sabotage their own information networks through excessive caution that prevented effective use of intelligence that was actually reliable, overcorrection from failed operation making British intelligence less effective, their own networks suffering from internal distrust and from commanders' reluctance to accept intelligence assessments at face value, skepticism about intelligence quality becoming self-fulfilling prophecy, when hesitation to act on information gave Americans time to move forces or to strengthen positions. Sabotage, meaning British damaged their intelligence capabilities through losing confidence in sources and methods that had been effective before operational failure. Overcorrection from single disaster, producing long-term degradation of intelligence effectiveness that benefited Americans through reducing British ability to exploit information about continental positions and intentions, making Traitor's inadvertent contribution to American cause extend beyond single failed operation into systemic damage to British intelligence. Confidence that made them less able to capitalize on information they did obtain, giving Continental Army breathing room when British commanders' skepticism about intelligence made them miss or dismiss genuine opportunities that aggressive exploitation might have converted into victories if British had maintained confidence in their intelligence operations. A traitor's legacy hidden in shadows was lasting damage to British operations that his betrayal had inadvertently inflicted through triggering intelligence failures and operational overcaution. Though reviled by Americans who knew of his betrayal, his actual legacy was damage to British effectiveness that his failed treason had produced, ironic outcome being that Traitor harmed British cause more than American cause despite his intentions. His betrayal permanently damages British coordination through creating distrust that made commanders reluctant to cooperate with intelligence services or to trust information about American positions, failed operations legacy being long-term degradation of British operational effectiveness. Permanently suggesting that damage was not quickly repaired, British intelligence community's loss of confidence persisting through remaining war years. And buys Continental Army time it desperately needs through preventing British from exploiting intelligence advantages that aggressive action might have converted into victories, British hesitation allowing Americans to recover from 1780s crises. Time being precious commodity when Continental Army needed months for rebuilding after Charleston's loss and for addressing supply crises that threatened military effectiveness. It desperately needs in sense that Continental Army was on verge of collapse when multiple crises threatened to destroy American military capacity, breathing room from British operational caution being essential for American recovery. In 1780, when failed British operation occurred during year when American cause was most vulnerable, timing making operational failures consequences particularly significant for American survival. Needs when examining how close Continental Army came to dissolution, Traitor's inadvertent contribution being that failed betrayal bought Americans time they used for stabilizing military situation and for rebuilding forces that would eventually succeed in forcing British recognition of American independence, making Traitor's hidden legacy, his damage to British cause that he had attempted to serve through betrayal that backfired completely when producing outcomes opposite to his intentions, creating situation where Americans who had condemned him as villain should have been secretly grateful that his imperfect treason had damaged British more than Americans, despite his malicious intent to betray revolution he had served, before desperation drove him to treason. The man who saved nation by trying to destroy it represents historical irony that forgotten traitors' failed betrayal produced outcomes that preserved rather than destroyed American Revolution. Closes with final truth acknowledging that American independence resulted from combination of heroism and accidents, whose interaction produced outcomes that neither patriots nor traitors intended when their actions combined to create circumstances favoring American survival. The revolution survived not only because of heroes whose sacrifices and achievements receive historical recognition, but also because of forgotten traitor whose imperfect betrayal damaged British cause more than American cause. Because of rather than despite traitors' actions when examining how failed British operation influenced war's trajectory, ironic contribution being that betrayal's inadvertent effects were beneficial for Americans despite malicious intent. Whose imperfect betrayal meant that intelligence he provided was accurate, but that British exploitation was flawed, combination producing British defeat rather than American disaster. Shattered British plan through convincing commanders to act prematurely, intelligence quality being Traitor's contribution, but operational failure being British responsibility when examining why intelligence led to disaster. That should have ended war if executed properly, British plan's concept being sound, and intelligence being adequate for achieving decisive victory that circumstances prevented. History remembers him as villain, in fragmentary records that survived suppression, his condemnation being appropriate given his treasonous intent regardless of unintended outcomes. But America exists partly because of him when examining how failed British operation influenced war's outcome during critical period when Continental Army might have collapsed if British had achieved decisive victory, making Traitor's inadvertent contribution significant, despite his intentions being malicious, demonstrating that historical outcomes result from complex interactions between intentions and accidents that combine unpredictably, sometimes producing results that neither heroes nor villains intended when their actions intersected through circumstances that turned betrayal into salvation, and that turned Traitor, whose name was erased from history, into accidental savior, whose failed treason preserved revolution he had attempted to destroy through providing intelligence that British trusted too much and exploited too poorly. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.